The train whistle pierced the crisp autumn air as it rumbled into Murphy's, California, carrying with it a woman whose trembling hands clutched a crumpled letter, her only connection to the man she was about to marry, but had never met. Bernadette Zimmerman stared through the soot-stained window at the dusty mining town that would now be her home, her throat so tight with fear she hadn't spoken a word since crossing the California border. The year was 1867, and the country was still healing from the wounds of the Civil War. Bernadette had left behind everything familiar in Boston, her childhood home, the graves of her parents, and the whispers that followed her after the scandal that had destroyed her family's name. At 22, with no prospects and no fortune, answering an advertisement for a bride had seemed her only option. The train lurched to a stop, belching steam and coal smoke into the golden afternoon light. Bernadette gathered her single valise, the meager possessions of her former life packed neatly inside. Her fingers traced the outline of the daguerreotype, tucked into her pocket the image of Jacob Zimmer, the cattle rancher who had paid her passage west. Last stop, Murphy's. The conductor called, swinging through the passenger car. Everyone out for Murphy's. Bernadette rose on unsteady legs, smoothing her travel-worn blue dress. She had been beautiful once, before grief and hardship had hollowed her cheeks and shadowed her gray-blue eyes. Still, her honey-blonde hair caught the sunlight as she stepped onto the wooden platform, looking lost among the crowd of miners, merchants, and travelers. A tall man stood apart from the others, his broad shoulders squared beneath a worn leather vest. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but Bernadette recognized him immediately from the photograph. Jacob Zimmer was exactly as he appeared in the daguerreotype, perhaps even more imposing in person, sun-bronzed skin, strong jaw darkened with stubble, and eyes the color of the California sky. "Miss Zimmerman." His voice was deep but gentle as he approached, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. "I'm Jacob Zimmer." Bernadette nodded, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. She opened her mouth to speak, but terror closed her throat. What if he found her lacking? What if he changed his mind upon seeing her? What if he was cruel behind those kind eyes? Jacob's expression softened as he recognized her fear. "You must be tired from your journey," he said, reaching for her valise. "My wagon's just over here. It's not a long ride to the ranch." She surrendered her bag, falling into step beside him. The busy platform swirled with activity around them, reuniting families, workers unloading cargo, children darting between legs. Bernadette felt as if she were drowning in the noise and movement. Jacob helped her into the wagon with a careful hand at her elbow, then settled beside her on the bench seat. He glanced at her, clearly waiting for her to speak, but when she remained silent, his expression showed no impatience. "I know this must be overwhelming," he said as he flicked the reins, guiding the horses away from the station. "Coming to a new place, meeting a stranger you're meant to marry." He paused, then added softly, "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere." The simple kindness in those words nearly broke something inside Bernadette. She looked at his profile, the straight nose and the unexpected gentleness around his mouth, and felt the first tiny seed of hope take root. The wagon rolled through Murphy's, past the general store, saloon, and church. Women in calico dresses nodded in greeting, curious eyes following the wagon. Children chased a hoop down the dusty main street. The town was small but thriving, with fresh paint on some buildings signaling prosperity from the nearby gold mines. "The ranch is about 3 miles outside town," Jacob explained as they left the buildings behind. "It's not the biggest spread in the county, but the land is good. There's a creek that runs year-round, even in the dry summers." Bernadette listened, grateful that he didn't seem to expect a response. The countryside opened before them, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, the distant mountains blue against the horizon. It was beautiful in a wild, untamed way, so different from Boston's manicured gardens and cobblestone streets. Jacob's ranch appeared as they crested a gentle hill, a modest two-story house painted white with green shutters, a large barn, and several outbuildings. A split-rail fence enclosed a corral where horses grazed. Cattle dotted the pastures beyond, and smoke curled from the house's stone chimney. "Home," Jacob said simply, a note of pride in his voice. As they approached, a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. She was perhaps 50, with silver streaking her dark hair, and her face creased into a welcoming smile. "That's Mrs. Holly's," Jacob explained. "She comes from town 3 days a week to help with cooking and cleaning. I wanted her here to welcome you." The wagon pulled to a stop in front of the house, and Jacob jumped down, coming around to help Bernadette. His hands were strong and calloused but gentle at her waist as he lifted her to the ground. "Welcome, Miss Zimmerman," Mrs. Hollis called. "I've got supper nearly ready, and your room is all prepared." Bernadette managed a smile and nod, clutching her valise like a shield. "Miss Zimmerman has had a long journey, Mrs. Hollis," Jacob said, his voice carrying an unspoken message. "I'm sure she'd like to rest before supper." Of course," Mrs. Hollis said, understanding immediately. "Come along, dear. Let me show you to your room." Jacob retrieved Bernadette's trunk from the back of the wagon. "I'll bring this up," he said. "Take all the time you need to settle in." The interior of the house surprised Bernadette. She had expected something crude and unfinished, but while simple, it was clean and comfortable. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a polished wooden table and chairs, a sofa covered in worn but clean fabric, and bookshelves lined with volumes. Curtains framed the windows, and a braided rug covered part of the plank floor. Mrs. Hollis led her upstairs to a bedroom at the front of the house. "Mr. Zimmer fixed this up special for you," she said, opening the door. "Put in the new bed and curtains himself." The room was larger than Bernadette had expected, with a 4-poster bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a small writing desk by the window, and a wardrobe. Fresh wildflowers stood in a jar on the bedside table, and the windows looked out over the rolling hills. "The water closet is at the end of the hall," Mrs. Hollis continued. "Mr. Zimmer put it in last year, very modern. There's a pump in the kitchen for washing, but he had pipes run upstairs too." She beamed with obvious pride in the house's amenities. Jacob appeared in the doorway with Bernadette's trunk, setting it carefully at the foot of the bed. "Supper will be ready in about an hour," he said. "Or I can have Mrs. Hollis bring something up if you'd prefer to eat alone tonight." Bernadette wanted to thank him for his thoughtfulness, but the words remained trapped. She shook her head slightly. "She'll come down," Mrs. Hollis interpreted confidently. "Nothing like a good meal after a long journey." When they left her alone, Bernadette sank onto the edge of the bed, unexpected tears filling her eyes. This room, this house, this man, all were better than she had dared to hope. She opened her valise and took out the few personal items she had brought: a silver-backed hairbrush that had been her mother's, a small book of poetry, a cameo brooch. She moved to the washstand and poured water from the pitcher into the basin, washing away the dust of travel. In the small mirror, her reflection stared back pale, with shadows beneath her eyes. She unpinned her hair, letting the blonde waves fall around her shoulders, then changed from her travel dress into a simpler blue gown. By the time she descended the stairs, Mrs. Hollis had set the table and was placing a roast chicken at its center. The tantalizing aroma of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air. "There you are," Jacob said, rising from where he had been reading by the fire. "Feel better after your rest?" Bernadette nodded, taking the seat he pulled out for her. Mrs. Hollis bustled around them, serving mashed potatoes, gravy, and fresh green beans alongside the chicken. "I'll be going now," she said when everything was arranged. "I'll be back tomorrow morning to help Miss Zimmerman get settled." She patted Bernadette's shoulder. "Don't you worry about a thing, dear." After Mrs. Hollis departed, Jacob and Bernadette sat across from each other at the table. He bowed his head briefly in a silent grace, then began serving her plate. "I hope you like chicken," he said. "Mrs. Hollis makes the best in the county." The simple domestic scene felt surreal to Bernadette after the long, lonely journey. She accepted the plate with a small smile of thanks and began to eat. The food was delicious, but she could only manage small bites. Her stomach still knotted with anxiety. Jacob didn't press her for conversation, instead sharing information about the ranch and town. "Murphy's started as a gold mining camp about 15 years ago," he explained. "It's calmer now than in the early days, but we still get the occasional troublemaker. Mostly it's a good community church socials, barn raisings when needed. The general store gets fresh supplies twice a month." As they ate, darkness fell outside the windows and Jacob lit the oil lamps. Their golden light softened the edges of the room, creating a cozy atmosphere despite Bernadette's nervousness. "I should explain about our arrangement," Jacob said as they finished eating. "I know what the mail-order bride advertisements imply, but I want you to know that I don't expect anything of you right away." He met her eyes across the table. "We're strangers to each other. I thought we could take some time to become acquainted before making any decisions about marriage." Relief flooded through Bernadette, and she found herself nodding gratefully. "I've prepared the upstairs bedroom for you, and I'll sleep in the small room off the kitchen," he continued. "If, after a proper courtship, you decide this life isn't for you, I'll pay your fare back east. You won't be trapped here." His words were so unexpected, so decent, that Bernadette felt tears threatening again. She ducked her head, overwhelmed by his consideration. "You don't have to speak until you're ready," Jacob said gently. "I can see you've been through something difficult. Words aren't always necessary." He stood and began clearing the dishes. "Why don't you rest tonight? Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, I could show you around the ranch." Bernadette retired to her room soon after, the emotional exhaustion of the day catching up with her. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes, she thought about the man downstairs. Jacob Zimmer was nothing like what she had feared. There was a steadiness to him, a patience that soothed her frayed nerves. She drifted to sleep wondering if perhaps, in this place so far from her past, she might find a future after all. Morning came with golden light streaming through her window and the distant lowing of cattle. Bernadette dressed in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, pinning her hair in a simple knot at the nape of her neck. When she ventured downstairs, she found Jacob at the stove, cooking eggs and bacon. "Good morning," he said with a smile. "I hope you slept well. Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Bernadette nodded, taking the cup he offered. The rich aroma reminded her that small pleasures still existed in the world. "Mrs. Hollis will be here later," Jacob said as he served the eggs. "But I thought maybe I could show you the ranch first if you'd like." After breakfast, they stepped out into the crisp morning air. Jacob led her first to the garden beside the house, where late-season vegetables were still growing: carrots, turnips, cabbages, and pumpkins. "Mrs. Hollis helps, but it could use a woman's touch," he said. "I'm not much of a gardener." From there, they walked to the chicken coop, where a dozen hens scratched in the dirt. "Fresh eggs almost every day," Jacob said, opening the small door to show her the nest boxes. The barn was next a large structure that smelled of hay and horses. Inside, 4 horses occupied stalls, their heads turning curiously toward the visitors. "That's Thunder," Jacob said, pointing to a large black gelding. "He's my working horse. The brown mare is Sadie. She pulls the wagon, and she's gentle enough for anyone to ride. The other 2 are for the ranch hands." Bernadette approached Sadie's stall, extending her hand. The mare snuffled her palm, then allowed her to stroke the velvety nose. It was the closest to happy Bernadette had felt in months. "You like horses?" Jacob asked, watching her. She nodded, continuing to pet Sadie. "She's yours if you want her," he offered. "Every woman should have her own horse out here." Bernadette looked up in surprise, then back at the gentle mare. She managed her first genuine smile since arriving. They continued the tour, the corral where Jacob broke the younger horses, the blacksmith's forge where he made simple repairs, the bunkhouse where the 2 ranch hands lived, though they were out with the cattle that morning. "Joaquin and Thomas have been with me for 3 years, Jacob explained. "Good men, hard-working. They mostly handle the cattle while I manage the horses." Beyond the buildings, the land stretched in all directions, pastures, oak groves, and in the distance, the foothills rising toward the Sierra Nevada mountains. A creek wound through the property, clear water sparkling in the morning sun. "It's beautiful," Bernadette whispered, the words slipping out before she realized she had spoken. Jacob turned to her in surprise, then smiled, the expression warming his eyes. "You have a lovely voice," he said simply. Embarrassment flooded her cheeks and she looked away, immediately retreating into silence. "I'm sorry," Jacob said quickly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. Let's head back. Mrs. Hollies will be arriving soon." They walked back to the house in silence, but it wasn't an uneasy one. Jacob maintained a respectful distance, not pressing her for more words or explanation. Mrs. Hollies arrived in a flurry of energy and chatter, her wagon laden with supplies from town. "I've brought some fabric for curtains," she announced, "and some preserves from my cellar, blackberry and peach. Oh, and the mail came yesterday." She handed Jacob a small stack of envelopes. While Jacob sorted through the mail, Mrs. Hollies drew Bernadette into the kitchen. "Now then, dear," she said kindly, "I thought I might show you where everything is kept. Mr. Zimmer's a good man but hopeless about organizing a kitchen." The older woman's matter-of-fact manner was comforting, requiring no response beyond nodding as she pointed out pantry supplies, cooking implements, and cleaning materials. "I come Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays," she explained. "Do the heavy cleaning, baking, and laundry. But day-to-day cooking and tidying would fall to you if you decide to stay." There was no judgment in her tone, just practical information, and Bernadette found herself warming to the straightforward woman. "Mr. Zimmer told me you might need time to find your voice," Mrs. Hollies continued, lowering her voice. "Don't you worry about that. Words come when they're ready. My own sister didn't speak for nearly a year after she lost her husband in the war. Sometimes the heart needs silence to heal." Touched by the woman's understanding, Bernadette impulsively reached out to squeeze her hand in gratitude. "Now then," Mrs. Holly said briskly, "let's see about those curtains." The day passed in a comfortable rhythm of domestic tasks. Bernadette helped Mrs. Hollies measure windows for curtains, learned where linens were stored, and assisted in preparing a stew for supper. Jacob was mostly absent, attending to ranch chores, but he returned at midday for a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and cold meat. "I need to ride out to check the north pasture this afternoon," he told Bernadette. "I'll be back before sunset. Will you be all right here with Mrs. Hollies?" She nodded, finding his concern for her comfort touching. After Jacob left, Mrs. Holly settled at the kitchen table with needle and thread, beginning work on the curtains. "Why don't you tell me a bit about yourself, dear?" she suggested. "Just nod or shake your head to my questions. Are you from back east?" Bernadette nodded, sitting across from her with her own needlework, a handkerchief she was embroidering. "Boston," Mr. Zimmer said. "That's a fine city, I hear. Did you have family there?" A slight hesitation, then a shake of her head. Mrs. Holly's expression softened. "I'm sorry, dear. It's hard being alone in the world. Is that why you answered Mr. Zimmer's advertisement?" A nod, eyes downcast. "Well, you couldn't have found a better man," Mrs. Holly said firmly. "Known him since he came here after the war, just a young man with dreams and determination. Built this ranch from nearly nothing, he did. Never seen him treat anyone with anything but respect, be they rich, poor, white, Mexican, or Chinese. Not common in these parts, that kind of decency." Bernadette listened, allowing herself to be comforted by the woman's assessment. It aligned with her own observations of Jacob, but hearing it confirmed eased something inside her. "Of course, he's had his share of suffering," Mrs. Hollis continued. "Lost his parents young, then fought in the war, came back changed like so many did. Doesn't talk about it much, but you can see it in his eyes sometimes." The conversation, one-sided though it was, continued through the afternoon. Mrs. Hollis seemed to understand exactly how much information to share, giving Bernadette glimpses into the community and Jacob's place in it without overwhelming her. By the time Jacob returned, the kitchen was filled with the aroma of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie. Mrs. Hollis had departed, leaving detailed instructions for heating everything for supper. "Smells wonderful in here," Jacob said as he hung his hat by the door. He looked tired but satisfied, the day's work evidently successful. "Did you have a good afternoon with Mrs. Hollis?" Bernadette nodded, gesturing toward the stove where the stew simmered. "I'll just wash up," he said, understanding her silent communication. Supper was a quiet affair, but less tense than the previous evening. Jacob spoke about his day, the cattle he'd checked, a fence that needed mending, plans for selling some horses in Sacramento the following month. "The ranch is doing well," he explained. "Not the biggest in the county, but we turn a profit. I've been saving to expand maybe by the Henderson place next spring if old man Henderson finally decides to retire to San Francisco like he's been threatening." As they finished eating, Jacob cleared his throat. "I was thinking, if you're interested, we could ride into town tomorrow. Sunday services in the morning, then maybe lunch at the hotel. Give you a chance to see Murphy's properly, meet some folks." Fear must have shown on Bernadette's face because he quickly added, "Or not if that seems too much. There's no rush." She hesitated, then nodded slowly. The thought of meeting strangers terrified her, but she knew she couldn't hide at the ranch forever, and Jacob would be with her. "Just a short visit," he promised. "And if it becomes too much, we'll come straight home." That night, lying in bed, Bernadette reflected on how easily Jacob had referred to the ranch as home. For him, it clearly was. For her, it was still a strange place, albeit a safer one than she had expected. But for the first time in many months, she allowed herself to imagine a future riding Sadie across the fields, tending the garden, making this house truly a home. With that fragile hope warming her heart, she drifted into a dreamless sleep. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. Bernadette dressed in her best gown, a dove gray silk with subtle lace at the collar and cuffs. It was slightly outdated by Boston standards, but she doubted anyone in Murphy's would notice or care. She pinned her hair in a neat chignon and added her mother's cameo brooch. Jacob waited at the foot of the stairs, dressed in a clean dark suit that transformed him from rancher to gentleman. He stared for a moment when she descended, admiration clear in his eyes. "You look beautiful," he said simply. They drove to town in the wagon, the crisp autumn air carrying the scent of pine from the surrounding hills. Murphy's was busy with people heading to the white clapboard church at the end of Main Street. Women in their Sunday best nodded curiously as Jacob helped Bernadette down from the wagon, and men tipped their hats respectfully. "That's Jacob Zimmer's mail-order bride," Bernadette heard a woman whisper to her companion. "Arrived yesterday on the afternoon train." "Pretty little thing," came the reply. "Hope she's stronger than she looks. Ranching's hard work." Jacob led her toward the church, his hand lightly at the small of her back, a reassuring presence amid the curious stares. "Reverend Miller is a good man," he murmured. "Keeps his sermons mercifully short." The church was nearly full when they arrived, but Jacob guided her to a pew near the back. As they settled, a hush fell over the congregation, heads turning to study the newcomer. Bernadette kept her eyes fixed on her prayer book, fighting the urge to flee. "Folks are just curious," Jacob whispered. "It'll pass once they get used to you." The service began, and gradually the attention shifted to Reverend Miller, a tall man with kind eyes and a resonant voice. His sermon focused on community and welcoming strangers, and Bernadette wondered if he had chosen the topic with her in mind. As the final hymn ended, Reverend Miller made his way down the aisle, greeting parishioners. When he reached their pew, his smile was warm. "Jacob, good to see you," he said, extending his hand. "And this must be Miss Zimmerman. Welcome to Murphy's." Jacob performed the introduction, explaining smoothly, "Miss Zimmerman is still recovering from her journey. She's resting her voice." The Reverend nodded understandingly. "The journey west can be taxing indeed. Please know that our community is here to support you both." Others approached after the Reverend moved on the mayor and his wife, the general store owner, several ranching families. Jacob fielded most questions, shielding Bernadette from having to respond, but introducing her to each person with evident pride. "Jacob Zimmer, you've been holding out on us," a woman in an elaborate feathered hat declared, eyeing Bernadette critically. "She's far too refined for a rough rancher like you." "I'm the first to agree, Mrs. Porter," Jacob replied good-naturedly. "I count myself fortunate that Miss Zimmerman was willing to consider my proposal." The woman sniffed, but seemed mollified by his response. By the time they exited the church, Bernadette felt overwhelmed by the tide of new faces and names. Jacob sensed her distress and steered her toward the hotel restaurant, where he requested a table in a quiet corner. "You're doing wonderfully," he assured her once they were seated. "I know it's a lot to take in all at once." The hotel dining room was elegant by frontier standards, with white tablecloths and proper silverware. A few other diners glanced their way, but the atmosphere was more relaxed than at church. "The roast beef is excellent here," Jacob said, studying the menu. "And Mrs. Chen makes the best apple dumplings west of the Mississippi." They ordered, and while they waited for their food, Jacob pointed out people he knew through the window that overlooked the main street. "That's Doc Wilson crossing the street," he said. "Best physician in the county, though he's getting on in years. And there's Sheriff Davis talking to him, honest lawman, fair to everyone." Their meal arrived, and Bernadette found herself hungrier than expected after the morning's social exertion. The roast beef was indeed excellent, accompanied by fluffy mashed potatoes and glazed carrots. "I was thinking," Jacob said as they ate, "that we might visit the general store after lunch. You might want some fabric or personal items Mrs. Hollies didn't think to get." Bernadette nodded, grateful for his thoughtfulness. The general store was a marvel of frontier commerce, its shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to tools, fabric to patent medicines. The proprietor, Mr. Jenkins, greeted Jacob warmly. "So this is your bride," he said, studying Bernadette. "Welcome to Murphy's, Miss Zimmerman. Anything you need, you just let me know." Jacob explained that Bernadette was conserving her voice, then encouraged her to browse while he discussed an order of fencing supplies with Mr. Jenkins. She wandered through the store, examining bolts of fabric, jars of hard candies, and a display of hair combs and pins. It was well stocked for a frontier town, evidence of Murphy's prosperity. She selected a few items: blue gingham fabric for kitchen curtains, embroidery thread, a small bottle of rose water, and a journal with a leather cover. The last item was an indulgence, but she suddenly felt the need to record her thoughts, even if she couldn't voice them. Jacob added her selections to his order without comment, though his eyes lingered on the journal with what might have been approval. He also added several books from the small shelf near the counter. "Miss Zimmerman enjoys reading," he told Mr. Jenkins. "Do you have anything new since my last visit?" "Got in a shipment last week," the storekeeper replied. "Some Dickens, a few of those ladies' novels, and Mark Twain's new book about his travels." Bernadette's eyes lit up at the mention of Twain, and Jacob noticed immediately. "We'll take the Twain," he decided. "And maybe one of the ladies' novels, whichever you recommend, Mr. Jenkins." As they left the store, packages in hand, Jacob said, "I hope you don't mind the books. I noticed you had brought a volume of poetry, and I thought you might enjoy something new to read." Bernadette smiled, genuinely touched by his observation and thoughtfulness. Their walk back to the wagon took them past the town's small schoolhouse, where children played in the yard despite it being Sunday. A young woman supervised, her dark hair neatly pinned beneath a modest hat. "Miss Sullivan," Jacob called in greeting. "Still keeping the children occupied on your day off?" the woman approached, smiling warmly. "Someone has to, Mr. Zimmer. If they're here, they're not getting into mischief elsewhere." Her curious gaze shifted to Bernadette. "This is Miss Bernadette Zimmerman," Jacob introduced. "Miss Zimmerman, this is Diana Sullivan, Murphy's schoolteacher." "It's a pleasure," Miss Sullivan said. "We've been so curious since hearing Mr. Zimmer had sent for a bride. I hope you're finding Murphy's welcoming." Bernadette nodded, managing a small smile. "Miss Zimmerman is resting her voice after her journey," Jacob explained. "Of course," Miss Sullivan said, accepting the explanation without question. "Travel can be so taxing. Once you're settled, perhaps you might consider visiting the school. We're always grateful for new books or assistance with the younger children." The idea of working with children appealed to Bernadette, who had once aspired to teach before circumstances forced her in another direction. She nodded more enthusiastically. "Wonderful," Miss Sullivan beamed. "We have 28 pupils this term, ages 5 to 16. It's quite the challenge for one teacher." After a few more minutes of conversation, they continued to the wagon. As Jacob helped her up, he said, "You seemed interested in Miss Sullivan's invitation. Were you perhaps a teacher back east?" Bernadette hesitated, then shook her head, holding up her hand with thumb and forefinger close together. "Almost became one," Jacob guessed. She nodded, impressed by his ability to interpret her gestures. "You'd be good at it, I think," he said as they started back toward the ranch. "You have a patience about you and kind eyes." The compliment brought unexpected warmth to her cheeks, and she looked away, embarrassed yet pleased. The remainder of Sunday passed quietly. Jacob showed Bernadette his small library, inviting her to borrow any volumes that interested her. They shared a simple supper of cold chicken and freshly baked bread, and as darkness fell, Jacob built a fire in the main room's hearth. "I usually read in the evenings," he said, settling into an armchair with one of the books they had purchased. "Feel free to join me, or retire if you're tired from our excursion." Bernadette chose to stay, taking the chair opposite his with her new journal and a pencil. As the fire crackled and Jacob read quietly, she opened the blank pages and began to write, hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. "I arrived in Murphy's yesterday," she wrote. "Jacob Zimmer is not what I expected. He is kind and patient, asking nothing of me that I cannot give. The ranch is beautiful wild, but with a certain peace I have never known. The town seems welcoming, though I fear what they would think if they knew my past. I still cannot speak. The words stick in my throat like stones, but Jacob doesn't press me. 'Take your time,' he said. 'I'm not going anywhere.' Such simple words, but they have given me hope that perhaps here, far from Boston and its memories, I might find my voice again." She glanced up to find Jacob watching her, a thoughtful expression on his face. He smiled when their eyes met, then returned to his book, giving her privacy with her thoughts. Later, as she prepared for bed, Bernadette realized that for the first time in months, the knot of fear in her chest had loosened slightly. There was still so much uncertainty ahead, but Jacob's steady presence and the peaceful ranch offered a sanctuary she desperately needed. Days passed in a gentle rhythm. Mrs. Hollies came 3 times a week, gradually ceding more household responsibilities to Bernadette as she became familiar with the ranch. Jacob worked from dawn until dusk, returning with stories of calves born, horses trained, and the changing seasons evident in the landscape. Bernadette discovered a contentment in domestic tasks she had never expected to find. She learned to bake bread in the large kitchen oven, planted late-season herbs in small pots for the kitchen windowsill, and with Mrs. Hollies' guidance, began putting up preserves for the winter. She also began riding Sadie, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Jacob accompanied her initially, showing her the boundaries of the ranch property, the best places to cross the creek, the meadow where wildflowers bloomed even in late autumn. "You're a natural horsewoman," he told her after one such ride, helping her down from the saddle. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and their eyes met briefly before he stepped back, clearing his throat. Such moments occurred with increasing frequency, a brush of hands as they both reached for the same dish at supper, catching each other's gaze across the room, the way Jacob sometimes watched her, when he thought she wouldn't notice. Bernadette found herself noticing details about him, the way sunlight caught the hints of auburn in his dark hair, how his hands, though calloused from work, moved with unexpected grace, the smile that transformed his serious face. October gave way to November, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain. One evening, as wind rattled the windows and rain drummed on the roof, they sat before the fire after supper. Jacob was mending a bridle, his strong fingers working the leather with practiced ease, while Bernadette embroidered a pillowcase, adding delicate blue forget-me-nots to the plain white cotton. "Winter comes early up here," Jacob said, glancing toward the window where darkness pressed against the glass. "Not like the coastal areas. We'll get snow before Christmas, most likely." Bernadette looked up from her needlework, a question in her eyes. "Are you worried about the winter?" he asked, interpreting her expression. She nodded slightly. Boston winters had been cold, but she had spent them in a well-insulated townhouse with coal furnaces and close neighbors. "The house is solid," Jacob assured her. "I've added insulation every year and we keep plenty of firewood stacked. The road to town sometimes closes after heavy snow, but never for more than a few days." He set aside the bridle. "I've been meaning to ask, would you like to go into town for Thanksgiving? The hotel serves a special dinner and almost everyone attends." The thought of such a large social gathering sent a flicker of panic through Bernadette, but she had grown more comfortable with the townspeople during their occasional visits. She nodded cautiously. "Good," Jacob said, his smile warming his eyes. "It's a nice tradition." Afterwards, there's usually music and dancing at the town hall. Dancing. The word evoked memories of Boston ballrooms, of whirling in elegant circles before everything fell apart. Bernadette hadn't danced since her father's disgrace and death. "You don't have to dance," Jacob added, noting her expression. "We could just watch if you prefer." She offered a grateful smile, touched yet again by his sensitivity to her feelings. "Bernadette," he said, using her given name for the first time since her arrival, "I've been thinking. It's been over a month since you came to Murphy's. I promised you a proper courtship before any decisions were made, and I stand by that promise." He looked at her earnestly. "But I want you to know that I've come to care for you greatly. Your presence has brought something to this house that was missing: a warmth, a gentleness." Bernadette felt her heart quicken at his words. She too had developed feelings for Jacob: admiration for his integrity and work ethic, appreciation for his patience, and increasingly, a deeper emotion she wasn't yet ready to name. "I'm not asking for any declaration from you," he continued. "I just wanted you to know where I stand, and to assure you that whenever, if ever, you feel ready to speak about what brought you here, I'm prepared to listen without judgment." The sincerity in his blue eyes nearly broke her resolve to keep her past locked away. She set aside her embroidery and, in a gesture that surprised them both, reached across to place her hand over his. Jacob looked down at their joined hands, then back to her face. "I take it you're not entirely opposed to the idea of becoming Mrs. Zimmer someday?" he asked, a hint of humor softening the vulnerability in his voice. Bernadette shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Well, that's encouraging," Jacob said, turning his hand to hold hers properly. "I'll continue to court you properly, Miss Zimmerman, and try to win more than just your tolerance of my company." The moment was interrupted by a loud crack of thunder that made Bernadette jump, her hand pulling away from his. "Just a storm," Jacob said, rising to check that the windows were securely latched. "Sounds like it's right overhead." As if in confirmation, lightning flashed, illuminating the room in stark white light before plunging it back into the softer glow of oil lamps and firelight. The wind howled around the eaves and rain lashed against the glass. "I should check on the horses," Jacob said, reaching for his coat. "They get nervous in storms." Bernadette stood quickly, concern evident in her expression. "I won't be long," he promised. "The barn is sturdy, just want to make sure they're calm." He was gone before she could protest, the door closing firmly behind him. Bernadette moved to the window, straining to see through the darkness and driving rain. Lightning flashed again, revealing Jacob's figure hurrying toward the barn. The minutes stretched endlessly as the storm raged. Bernadette paced the room, jumping at particularly loud thunderclaps, her mind conjuring images of Jacob struck by lightning or the barn roof collapsing. Finally, unable to bear the waiting, she grabbed her shawl and headed for the door. The wind nearly knocked her back as she stepped onto the porch, and rain immediately soaked her dress. Lightning illuminated the yard, showing the barn door open and swinging wildly. Fear propelled her forward, across the muddy ground toward the looming structure. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered, and she could hear the nervous whinnying of horses. "Jacob," she called, her voice a ragged whisper that disappeared into the howling wind. He emerged from one of the stalls, shock registering on his face when he saw her. "Bernadette, what are you doing out in this?" A tremendous crash drowned out any response she might have made, as a large branch sheared from a nearby oak and slammed into the barn's roof. Wooden beams groaned ominously, and dust and debris rained down. "We need to get the horses out," Jacob shouted, rushing to Thunder's stall. The roof might not hold. Bernadette didn't hesitate, moving to Sadie's stall and opening the door. The mare was frantic, eyes rolling in fear, but responded to Bernadette's gentle touch on her nose. "It's all right," she whispered, the words coming automatically in the crisis. "Come on, girl." She led Sadie toward the barn door as Jacob guided Thunder. The two other horses followed, instinct driving them toward safety. They had just cleared the doorway when there was another terrible cracking sound, and part of the roof collapsed behind them. Rain poured down on the small group as they led the horses to a lean-to shelter attached to the bunkhouse. It wasn't ideal, but it would protect them from the worst of the storm. "Are you all right?" Jacob asked when the horses were secured, turning to Bernadette, his face pale in the darkness. She nodded, suddenly aware that she had spoken aloud in the barn. The realization didn't bring the panic she expected, just a strange sense of relief, as if a dam had begun to crack. "We need to get back to the house," Jacob said, taking her elbow. "You're soaked through." They ran across the yard, the rain still driving down mercilessly. By the time they reached the porch, both were drenched, clothes clinging to their bodies, hair plastered to their heads. Inside, Jacob immediately built up the fire, then disappeared upstairs, returning with towels and a blanket. "You should change into dry clothes," he said, handing her a towel. "I'll make some hot tea." Bernadette hurried upstairs, peeling off her sodden dress and undergarments with trembling fingers. She dried herself quickly and put on a warm nightgown and robe, wrapping her wet hair in a towel. When she returned downstairs, Jacob had changed as well, into dry trousers and a clean shirt. He handed her a steaming cup of tea as she settled on the sofa near the fire. "Thank you for helping with the horses," he said, sitting beside her. "Though you shouldn't have come out in that storm. It was dangerous." "I was worried," Bernadette said, her voice rusty from disuse but audible. Jacob stared at her, surprise and joy mingling in his expression. "You spoke." She nodded, curling her fingers tightly around the warm cup. "In the barn, too, to Sadie." "Your voice is beautiful," he said softly, "even more so than I imagined." Bernadette took a sip of tea, gathering courage. "I'm sorry I couldn't speak before. I tried, but—" "You have nothing to apologize for," Jacob insisted. "I meant what I said. Take all the time you need." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the continuing storm outside. Finally, Bernadette set down her cup. "I should tell you why I came here," she said. "Why I couldn't speak." Jacob turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Only if you're ready." "My father was a banker in Boston," she began, the words coming slowly at first. "Respected, successful. We lived well, my parents, my younger sister, and I. Then last year there was a scandal. Father was accused of embezzlement, of stealing from his clients." She paused, the painful memories washing over her. There was a trial. Evidence was presented, ledgers in his handwriting, witness testimony. He maintained his innocence, but he was convicted. Jacob listened silently, his face compassionate. "He died in prison 3 months later," Bernadette continued, her voice strengthening. "Of pneumonia, they said, but I think it was a broken heart. He couldn't bear the disgrace, the loss of everything he had worked for." "I'm so sorry," Jacob said quietly. After his death, more evidence came to light. Another banker confessed to the crime, revealed that he had forged my father's handwriting, bribed witnesses. My father was innocent all along. Her hands trembled and Jacob gently took them in his. But it was too late. The damage was done. My mother had already died from the shock and shame of it all. My sister had been sent to live with an aunt in Philadelphia. "And you were left alone," Jacob said, understanding dawning. Bernadette nodded. "Boston society has a long memory. No one would receive me, hire me, acknowledge me." The family home and assets had been sold to pay father's legal fees and supposed restitution. I had nothing but my clothes and a few keepsakes. "So you answered my advertisement," Jacob said. "It seemed the only way to start fresh, somewhere no one knew the Zimmerman scandal." She looked down at their joined hands. "But after everything, I found I couldn't speak. The words just wouldn't come. It was as if all the accusations, the whispers, the shame had stolen my voice." Jacob squeezed her hands gently. "Thank you for telling me. It explains so much why you seemed so frightened, why you couldn't speak. I should have told you sooner, given you the chance to change your mind about me," she said. "My family name is tainted, even if unjustly." "Change my mind?" Jacob looked genuinely puzzled. "Bernadette, nothing you've told me changes how I feel about you. If anything, I admire you more, knowing what you've endured." "You don't care about the scandal." "I care that you were hurt," he said firmly. "I care that you lost your family unjustly. But no, I don't care about Boston society's opinion of the Zimmerman name. Out here, you make your own reputation through your actions, not your family history." Relief flooded through her, along with something warmer gratitude, affection, and perhaps something deeper still. "Thank you," she whispered. "For listening, for understanding. Always," Jacob promised. Then, with hesitation unusual for him, he added, "May I ask you something?" She nodded. "Now that you've found your voice again, and knowing how I feel about you, would you consider making our arrangement more official? I'm not rushing you," he hastened to add, "but I would very much like to court you properly, with the intention of marriage if you find you can return my feelings." Bernadette felt a smile forming, real and unrestrained. "I would like that very much," she said. "I've come to care for you too, Jacob. Your kindness, your patience, they've helped me begin to heal." His answering smile was radiant. "May I kiss you, Bernadette Zimmerman?" In answer, she leaned forward, meeting him halfway. His lips were warm and gentle against hers, the kiss brief but full of promise. When they parted, Jacob tucked a strand of damp hair behind her ear. "I'm glad you found your voice," he said softly. "But even in your silence, you spoke to my heart." Outside, the storm began to abate, the thunder now distant rumbles, the rain a gentle patter against the windows. Inside, a different kind of storm had passed, leaving clarity and hope in its wake. Thanksgiving arrived with a light dusting of snow that glittered in the morning sunlight. Bernadette stood at the bedroom window, watching as the world transformed into something magical and new. In the month since she had found her voice again, life had blossomed in ways she never could have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Murphy's. She and Jacob had settled into a comfortable courtship. Each evening by the fire, they shared stories of their pasts. Jacob's childhood in Missouri, his experiences during the war, though some memories he still couldn't speak of, his journey west and the early struggles establishing the ranch. Bernadette told him of happier times in Boston, her education, her sister's antics, books they both loved. During the days, they worked side by side when possible. Jacob had begun teaching her about ranch operations not because he expected her help, he explained, but because he wanted her to understand this life she was considering sharing permanently. As she dressed for their Thanksgiving outing, selecting a rich burgundy dress with black velvet trim that Mrs. Hollis had helped her alter for the occasion, Bernadette reflected on how far she had come. The fear that had gripped her for so long had receded, replaced by a growing confidence. "Bernadette," Jacob called from downstairs, "are you nearly ready? We should leave soon to get good seats at the hotel." "Coming," she replied, pinning the cameo brooch to her collar and taking a final glance in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed younger somehow, her eyes brighter, cheeks flushed with health from days spent in the clear mountain air. Jacob waited at the foot of the stairs, handsome in his Sunday suit, freshly shaved. His expression when he saw her was worth every minute spent preparing. "You're beautiful," he said simply, offering his arm. The drive to town was pleasant despite the cold, their wagon wheels crunching through the light snow. Murphy's had been decorated for the holiday, evergreen boughs hung from shop fronts, and red ribbons adorned lamp posts. The hotel dining room was transformed with autumn colors, tables arranged in long rows to accommodate the entire community. As Jacob had predicted, nearly everyone in town was present. The porters, dressed in city finery, nodded regally from their table near the front. Miss Sullivan, the schoolteacher, waved cheerfully from where she sat with several other unmarried ladies. Reverend Miller moved among the tables, offering blessings and good wishes. "Jacob, Miss Zimmerman," Mr. Jenkins, the storekeeper, called. "Come join us, we've saved seats." They joined the Jenkins family, along with Doc Wilson and Sheriff Davis. To Bernadette's relief, the conversation flowed easily, the townspeople now accustomed to her presence and delighted by her newfound voice. "You sound Eastern," Doc Wilson observed. "Boston, is it? My sister lives in Cambridge, fine medical school there." "Yes, I grew up in Boston," Bernadette confirmed, finding it easier each day to speak of her past. "Well, we're mighty glad you found your way to Murphy's," Mrs. Jenkins said warmly. "Jacob here's been needing a good woman to settle him down for years." "Martha," Mr. Jenkins chided, but with a smile. The meal was sumptuous: roast turkey, ham, various vegetables, fresh bread, and 3 types of pie for dessert. As they ate, Bernadette observed the diverse community, not just the prominent white citizens, but also the Chinese family who ran the laundry, several Mexican ranching families, and a few former slaves who had made their way west after emancipation. "Murphy's has its share of prejudice," Jacob murmured, following her gaze, "but less than many places. Gold fever brought all kinds here, and those who stayed learned to get along more or less." After the meal, the gathering moved to the town hall, where tables had been pushed aside to create a dance floor. A small band assembled fiddle, guitar, piano, and harmonica and began tuning their instruments. "Would you like to dance?" Jacob asked as the first notes of a waltz filled the air. "Only if you feel comfortable." Bernadette hesitated, then nodded. "I would like that." He led her onto the floor, his hand warm at her waist, and they joined the other couples circling the room. Jacob proved to be a capable dancer, guiding her smoothly through the steps. "Where did you learn to dance?" she asked, surprised by his skill. "My mother insisted," he replied with a smile. "Said no son of hers would grow up a complete rustic, even on the frontier." As they danced, Bernadette caught glimpses of their reflection in the windows, his dark head bent toward her fair one, their movements in perfect harmony. For the first time since her arrival, she felt truly part of this community, not just an outsider observing it. Later, as Jacob fetched them cups of punch, Diana Sullivan approached. "You dance beautifully together," the schoolteacher said. "And I'm so glad to hear your voice, Bernadette. Jacob told me you were recovering from an illness." "Thank you," Bernadette replied. "I'm feeling much better now. I was wondering if my offer still stands about helping at the school sometimes. We're preparing a Christmas pageant, and I could use another pair of hands with the costumes and rehearsals." The idea appealed greatly. "I'd like that," Bernadette said. "I've always enjoyed working with children." "Wonderful. Could you come Monday afternoon? The children would be thrilled to meet you. They're very curious about Mr. Zimmer's lady, as they call you." Jacob returned in time to hear the last part, his smile amused. "I like the sound of that," he said, handing Bernadette a cup of punch. The evening continued with more dancing and conversation. By the time they drove home under a star-filled sky, Bernadette felt a sense of belonging she had thought lost forever. "Did you enjoy yourself?" Jacob asked as they approached the ranch, the house a dark silhouette against the night sky. "Very much," she replied. "Everyone was so welcoming." "They see what I see," Jacob said, helping her down from the wagon. "A remarkable woman who makes this place better by her presence." In the weeks that followed, Bernadette fell into a new routine. Mornings were spent on household tasks. Afternoons often at the schoolhouse, helping Miss Sullivan with the Christmas preparations, and evenings with Jacob by the fire. The pageant became a particular joy. The children, initially shy around her, quickly warmed to her patience and creativity as she helped design simple costumes and coach them on their parts. "You're a natural teacher," Deanna remarked one afternoon as Bernadette helped a small girl practice her lines. "Have you considered taking the examination for a teaching certificate? I could use an assistant, and the town council has been discussing the need for a second teacher." The suggestion caught Bernadette by surprise. "I hadn't thought of it," she admitted. "I assumed my future would be as Jacob's wife, helping with the ranch." "The two aren't mutually exclusive," Deanna pointed out. "Several ranchers' wives teach or work in town. The school is only half-days, and you'd still have time for your duties at home." The idea took root in Bernadette's mind, a possibility she hadn't considered. That evening she mentioned it to Jacob as they sat by the fire. "What do you think?" she asked hesitantly. "Would you mind if I were to teach at the school?" Jacob looked up from his book, his expression thoughtful. "Mind? Why would I mind? You'd be wonderful with the children." "Some men might prefer their wives to focus solely on home and family," she explained. "I'm not some men," Jacob replied simply. "I want you to be happy, Bernadette. If teaching would fulfill you, then you should pursue it." His support warmed her more than the crackling fire. "I would still make our home my priority," she assured him, "but I did always dream of teaching." "Then you should do it," he said firmly. "We'll make it work." As December progressed, preparations for Christmas occupied much of their time. Jacob and the ranch hands cut a towering pine to place in the main room, and Bernadette decorated it with candles, paper ornaments made by the schoolchildren, and strings of dried berries and popcorn. The barn had been partially repaired after the storm damage, enough to shelter the horses and store hay, though more extensive work would need to wait until spring. Jacob had ordered a new weather vane for the roof, promising it would be even better than the one destroyed in the storm. 2 weeks before Christmas, a heavy snowfall blanketed the ranch. Jacob spent much of the day clearing paths between the buildings and checking on the cattle in the lower pastures. When he returned, stomping snow from his boots on the porch, his cheeks were ruddy with cold but his eyes bright with excitement. "I have something to show you," he said, helping Bernadette into her coat and wrapping a woolen scarf around her neck. "Bundle up, it's cold out there." Curious, she followed him outside where dusk was falling, turning the snowy landscape to shades of blue and purple. Jacob led her to the barn where a horse-drawn sleigh waited, polished runners gleaming in the lantern light. "Where did this come from?" she asked in delight. "It was my father's," Jacob explained. "I stored it in the back of the barn when I first came here, never thinking I'd have use for it, but with this snow and Christmas coming." He smiled almost shyly. "Would you like to go for a ride?" "Now, in the dark." "The moon's rising," he pointed out. "And I've put hot bricks wrapped in flannel under the seat to keep us warm. I thought we might drive into town to see the Christmas lights." It was a magical idea, and Bernadette readily agreed. Jacob harnessed Sadie and Thunder to the sleigh, then helped Bernadette onto the seat, tucking a thick buffalo robe around her legs. He settled beside her, took up the reins, and with a gentle command, set the horses in motion. The sleigh glided smoothly over the snow, runners hissing softly, harness bells jingling in the still night air. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, and the rising moon cast blue-white light across the landscape. "It's beautiful," Bernadette breathed, her voice forming small clouds in the cold air. "Yes, it is," Jacob agreed, but he was looking at her, not the scenery. The town appeared ahead, windows glowing with lamplight, evergreen wreaths adorning doors. They drove slowly down Main Street, exchanging greetings with the few people still out and about. The church was lit from within, choir practice underway for the Christmas service. As they headed back toward the ranch, the full moon now high overhead, Jacob guided the sleigh to a hilltop that offered a panoramic view of the valley. He brought the horses to a halt and wrapped an arm around Bernadette's shoulders, drawing her close against the cold. "Are you happy here?" he asked quietly, his breath warm against her cheek. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Happier than I ever expected to be again." "I have something for you," Jacob said, reaching into his coat pocket. "I was going to wait until Christmas, but this moment seems right." He held out a small box covered in velvet. Bernadette took it with trembling fingers and opened it to reveal a ring, a simple gold band set with a small diamond that caught the moonlight. "It was my mother's," Jacob explained. "Bernadette Zimmerman, I know we haven't known each other long, but I love you. I love your courage, your kindness, your strength. I love the way you've embraced this life and this community. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Bernadette's eyes, freezing on her lashes in the cold air. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes, Jacob, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then kissed her, his lips warm despite the winter chill. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. "After Christmas," she decided. "A new year, a new beginning for both of us." Jacob smiled, kissing her again before taking up the reins. "Let's go home," he said, the word carrying all the promise of their future together. The final weeks before Christmas passed in a flurry of activity and joy. News of their engagement spread quickly through Murphy's, bringing congratulations and well wishes. Mrs. Hollies was particularly delighted, declaring she had known from the start they were perfectly suited. "Just needed time to realize it yourselves," she said smugly, as she helped Bernadette prepare for the holiday. The Christmas pageant was a success, with the schoolchildren performing their parts with enthusiasm, if not perfect accuracy. Afterward, Bernadette found herself surrounded by parents expressing gratitude for her help and inquiring if she would indeed be joining Miss Sullivan as a teacher in the new year. "I hope to," she confirmed, "once I've taken the certification examination." On Christmas Eve, Jacob surprised her with another gift, a beautiful writing desk for her bedroom, crafted by the town's carpenter. "For your journal and letters," he explained. "Every writer needs a proper place to work." Bernadette's gift to him was more modest, a hand-knit scarf in deep blue that matched his eyes, and a journal similar to her own. "For your thoughts and plans for our future," she said as he unwrapped it. They attended the Christmas Eve service together, Bernadette's ring catching the candlelight as they sang carols in the crowded church. Reverend Miller's sermon focused on new beginnings and hope, themes that resonated deeply with both of them. Later, as they sat by the fire at home, cups of spiced cider in hand, Jacob said, "I've been thinking about our wedding. Would you prefer something simple here at the ranch or a larger celebration in town?" "Something in between, perhaps," Bernadette suggested. "The church, with our friends from town, but not too elaborate." "And when exactly?" "You said after Christmas, but—" "January 15th, she decided. "That gives us time to prepare, but not so long that we must endure Mrs. Porter's wedding planning suggestions." Jacob laughed, pulling her close. January 15th it is. I can't wait to make you my wife, Bernadette Zimmerman. And I can't wait to become Bernadette Zimmer, she replied, smiling at how their similar surnames had always seemed like a sign. Their wedding day dawned clear and cold, the snow glistening under a bright January sun. Bernadette dressed in her room with Mrs. Hollies and Deanna Sullivan assisting, donning a gown of ivory silk that Mrs. Hollies had helped alter from one found in the town's small dress shop. "Something borrowed," Deanna said, fastening a lace handkerchief to Bernadette's wrist with a ribbon. "It was my grandmother's." "Something blue," Mrs. Hollies added, presenting a sapphire pendant on a silver chain. "My husband gave it to me on our 30th anniversary. I want you to wear it today." Tears threatened as Bernadette accepted these tokens of friendship and support. "Thank you both," she said, "for everything." They traveled to town in the sleigh, now decorated with evergreen boughs and white ribbons. The church was filled with familiar faces, the Jenkins family. Doc Wilson and his wife, Sheriff Davis, the ranch hands in uncomfortable suits, and dozens of others who had become friends over the past months. Jacob waited at the altar, tall and handsome in a new suit, his expression one of awe as Bernadette walked toward him on Reverend Miller's arm. The minister had offered to escort her when she explained there was no family to give her away. "Who gives this woman to be married?" Reverend Miller asked as part of the ceremony. "She gives herself," he answered, "with the blessing of this community." The simple words touched Bernadette deeply, acknowledging both her independence and her acceptance into Murphy's. They spoke their vows clearly, promising to love, honor, and cherish each other through whatever life might bring. When Jacob slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands were steady but his eyes shone with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Reverend Miller declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Jacob's kiss was gentle but held the promise of passion to come, drawing good-natured cheers from their guests. The celebration continued at the hotel, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by nearly everyone in attendance. There was music and dancing, speeches and toasts, laughter and a few happy tears. As the afternoon waned, Jacob leaned close to Bernadette's ear. "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Zimmer?" The new name sent a thrill through her. "Yes," she whispered back. "I'm ready." They said their goodbyes amid knowing smiles and ribald jokes from some of the men, quickly shushed by their wives. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thoughts of the commitment they had made and the night ahead. At the ranch, Jacob surprised her by lifting her from the sleigh and carrying her across the threshold of their home. "Welcome home, wife," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room, where a fire burned welcomingly in the hearth. "Husband," she replied, the word still new and wonderful on her tongue. Later, much later, as they lay tangled in the sheets of what was now their shared bedroom, Bernadette rested her head on Jacob's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window in the moonlight. "What are you thinking?" Jacob asked, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. "That I'm grateful," she replied. "When I came here I was broken, voiceless, afraid. You gave me time and space to heal. You said, 'Take your time, I'm not going anywhere,' and you meant it." "Best decision I ever made," Jacob said, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Waiting for you to find your voice, your strength." "I love you, Jacob Zimmer," Bernadette said, the words coming easily now, natural as breathing. "And I love you, Bernadette Zimmer," he replied. "For all the days of our lives." 5 years later, the schoolhouse was abuzz with activity as children prepared for the spring festival. Bernadette moved among the desks, helping students with their projects, her rounded belly preceding her as she navigated the narrow aisles. "Mrs. Zimmer," called a small boy with a missing front tooth. "Is this right?" He held up a drawing of what might generously be called a horse. "That's wonderful, Thomas," she assured him. "Very creative." At the front of the room, Deanna Sullivan, now Deanna Davis since her marriage to the sheriff 2 years prior, clapped her hands for attention. "Children, remember your parents are invited to view your work tomorrow afternoon. Make sure everything is finished and has your name clearly marked." The dismissal bell rang, and the children gathered their belongings in a chaotic rush for the door. "Walk, don't run," Bernadette called, a daily reminder rarely heeded. As the last child departed, she sank gratefully into a chair, one hand resting on her 7-month pregnant belly. "You should be resting more," Deanna chided gently, gathering papers from her desk. "Jacob would have my head if he knew how much you were doing." "I'm perfectly fine," Bernadette assured her friend. "This baby is as strong as its father and brother, constantly active." As if on cue, a small boy of 4 burst through the doorway, dark hair tousled, blue eyes so like his father's bright with excitement. "Mama! Papa let me ride thunder all by myself today." Well, he was holding the reins, but still. "James Michael Zimmer," Bernadette said, opening her arms to her son. "What have we said about inside voices?" "Sorry, Mama," he said, not looking remotely apologetic as he launched himself into her embrace. "But it was amazing." Jacob appeared in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame, hat in hand. "Sorry about that," he said with a rueful smile. "He couldn't wait to tell you." "It's fine," Bernadette laughed, hugging James close before releasing him. "I'm glad you had an adventure with Papa." "We'll leave you to lock up," Jacob told Deanna. "Unless you need help with anything, go on." Deanna waved them out. "Sheriff Davis is collecting me shortly. We're having supper with the Jenkinses." Outside, the spring afternoon was warm, flowers blooming along the schoolhouse path. Jacob lifted James onto his shoulders, then offered his arm to Bernadette. They walked slowly toward where their wagon waited, nodding to townspeople as they passed. Murphy's had grown in the 5 years since Bernadette's arrival. A new hotel had been built, the general store expanded, and several new houses constructed on the outskirts. The Zimmer ranch had prospered as well, with Jacob's careful management and strategic expansion. "How are you feeling?" he asked as he helped her into the wagon, his hand lingering protectively over her stomach. "Tired but well," she assured him. "The baby's been kicking all day. I think we have another cowboy in the making." "Or a cowgirl," Jacob reminded her. "Your daughter might take after her mother's spirit." James, settled between them on the seat, piped up, "I want a brother. Girls are silly." "You might change your mind about that someday," Jacob told him with a wink at Bernadette. The ranch came into view as they crested the familiar hill, larger now, with an expanded barn to replace the one damaged in the storm years ago, new corrals, and a bunkhouse for the increased number of hands needed for their growing herd. The house remained largely the same, though Jacob had added a nursery when James was born, and was now preparing another room for the new baby. As they approached, a figure stepped onto the porch, a young woman with honey blonde hair similar to Bernadette's. Emily Zimmerman, Bernadette's sister, had come to live with them 3 years earlier after completing her schooling in Philadelphia. At 20, she now helped with the household and assisted Deanna at the school part-time while considering her own future. "You're back," she called, coming to help with James as Jacob lifted him down. "How was school today?" "Busy," Bernadette replied, accepting Jacob's assistance from the wagon. "The children are excited about the festival." "I've made lemonade," Emily said, "and Mrs. Holly's left a pie before she went home." Though Mrs. Holly still came 3 times a week, She did less now that Emily was there, and Bernadette had established her own routines for managing the household alongside her teaching duties. The older woman had become more like family than employee, joining them for Sunday dinners and special occasions. Later, after James was tucked into bed with stories of brave cowboys and his favorite wooden horse clutched in his small hand, Bernadette and Jacob sat on the porch swing, watching the sunset paint the hills in gold and pink. Emily had gone to her room to write letters, giving them their usual evening time alone. "I've been thinking," Jacob said, his arm around Bernadette's shoulders, hand absently stroking her arm. "We should take a trip after the baby comes and you're feeling up to it, perhaps to San Francisco. James is old enough to appreciate it now, and Emily's never seen the city." "That sounds wonderful," Bernadette agreed, leaning into his warmth. "I've always wanted to see the ocean." "Then we'll make it happen," he promised. "Perhaps in the fall when the weather is mild." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of the swing. Bernadette reflected on the journey that had brought her here from terrified, silent mail-order bride to confident wife, mother, and teacher. "What are you thinking about?" Jacob asked, echoing a question he had asked many times over their years together. "How fortunate I am," she replied honestly. "When I came here, I thought my life was over. Instead, it was just beginning." "We're the fortunate ones," Jacob corrected, placing his free hand on her rounded belly where their child grew. "You brought life and love back to this ranch to me." "Do you remember what you said to me that first day?" Bernadette asked, "when I couldn't speak?" Jacob smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Take your time," he quoted. "I'm not going anywhere." "You kept that promise," she said softly. "You gave me time to heal, to find my voice again." "And I'm still not going anywhere," he assured her, bending to kiss her gently. "Except wherever life takes us together." As darkness fell, and the first stars appeared in the velvet sky, Bernadette Zimmer, once voiceless and afraid, sat secure in the embrace of the man who had waited patiently for her to find the words to express what was in her heart. The story that had begun with silence had blossomed into a life filled with voices: her husband's steady declarations of love, her son's excited chatter, her sister's youthful enthusiasm, the community's acceptance and support, and her own voice, clear and confident at last, speaking of love, hope, and a future brighter than she had ever dared to dream.